So, today we'll be talking about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart and whether or not it was God hardening his heart or if Pharaoh hardened his own heart. And this can be found between the chapters of 5 through 11 in the book of Exodus. So, in the story of Exodus, God is fulfilling the blessing he gave to the Israelites by allowing them to grow in a population. Pharaoh notices the increase in Israelites and is threatened by them, so he devises a plan to banish their God. He puts them in slavery, and years later, a man named Moses, born of a Hebrew mother, is called by God to go to the Pharaoh and ask for freedom for the Israelites. So, because of this, Pharaoh says no, and God sends a total of 10 plagues. Each time, Pharaoh says no, and each plague is as follows. The first is water turns to blood. Then frogs, lice, flies, livestock die. There's boils on the skin, hail, locusts, darkness for 3 days, and then the killing of the firstborn. And this is where the Passover is formed, as the Israelites put a lamb's blood on their door, so they pass over, so they do not kill the first son, whereas people in Egypt, sons do get killed. Anyways, so in the story, the question we are trying to answer is whether or not God hardened Pharaoh's heart in him responding the way that he did in each plague, right? So he said no. So we're wondering whether or not God did it or Pharaoh did it to himself.
For our biblical interpretation paper, we studied the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. For the first section, we focused on looking at the passage. For the first 5 plagues in this story in Exodus, Pharaoh's heart is said to harden his own heart. I think that Pharaoh really had the opportunity to go to God in these moments, but instead he blatantly disobeyed him when he could easily follow God. And then the last 5 plagues, God is said to harden Pharaoh's heart. Pharaoh already had the choice, and at this point it was just a reflection of him already disobeying God. So God was following through with his character. So God cannot be with sin. God can only be apart from sin. God didn't want Pharaoh to have a hard heart. This is just a reflection of him hardening his own heart and God following through, being the God that he is, that's all powerful. I think that it is a historical narrative, and it is part of the Torah, which is the first, one of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Pharaoh was the king and held all power. Pharaoh had so much power that I think sometimes he took it to an extreme where he got a little cocky with it and he felt like he was his own God. And I think that kind of caused some of the downfall of him turning away from God, that created the hardening of his heart. The last point is the Israelites are multiplying greatly, gaining power. People are turning towards their God. This causes Pharaoh to begin to resent them. And that's Exodus 1:7. I think that he was a little bit jealous because he thought he was so powerful. And I think he also filled that void of him feeling like he was powerful, with in replace of God. And I think whenever something got in that way, it just was really ugly because it was another reflection of the sin that he was struggling with.
When we look at the passage of Exodus 5 to 11, there are many aspects that can help us to understand why Pharaoh and God did what they did. Looking at that book aspect of Look Book Took, starting with Pharaoh, he was looked at like a god, so this was tremendous pressure on him if things were going wrong, as his people would blame it on him. He was looked at as the middleman between the people of Egypt and the gods for being responsible for the spiritual well-being and the connections that they had together, which gives us some historical and cultural context. The Israelites at the time were also known for not believing in God and were outliers, which also contributed to why Pharaoh refused God. The Egyptians were so spiritually blinded at the time that they wouldn't even open their eyes to new ideas or religions. And finally, Pharaoh could have hardened his heart with his power he believed to possess, even though he didn't possess it. And instead, God could have hardened it with his true divine power. God gave Pharaoh the opportunity to turn to him, but he constantly refused as he believed he was all-powerful.
We took a portion of this question. The main thing that we took away from this is that God is always sovereign. So whether or not Pharaoh hardened his heart or God hardened it, God's sovereign power is definitely a truth throughout the whole story. We didn't really come to a specific conclusion, as it's really not very clear in the scriptures who exactly hardened Pharaoh's heart. But one thing we also do know is that Pharaoh had the free will to do so, as we all do. That's something that we can apply to our lives is we all have free will that God has gifted us, but God has power over that still. Another thing that we took away is that the Israelites trusted in God in some amazing ways, all through all the plagues and Pharaoh having power over them. The Israelites trusted in God, and that comes up again in Hebrews 11, where it talks about that they were able to make it through the Red Sea and the Egyptians were not. And it kind of says that even though they weren't exactly given what they were promised, they still were blessed through God's plan for them with something better. So yeah, we must trust in God even if his plan is not what we would have chosen. That was another one of our points of application to take from this question. And then lastly, just to connect it to the New Testament one more time, Jesus gave his life for us, so we are called to live for him. So that kind of goes with the Israelites, but also with Moses and Aaron. They were called to do some pretty hard things, but ultimately to live for God, and that's something that is really important in this story. So yeah.